So dear beloved community, I hope that you're well wherever you find yourself at this moment in time. For us who are connecting here in this moment, it's the 22nd of November in the year 2020, and it's wonderful to be sitting together again. Many years ago now, I had a dream, and in that dream, my teacher, Tay, came up behind me and he asked me a question. He said to me in the dream, well, Brother Pháp, is it yes or is it no? In my dream, I turned towards Tay and I said, yes, it's yes, Tay. So in terms of the practice, in terms of getting real, this saying yes is not only a one-time thing, but a moment-by-moment practice of opening to what is, of being willing to turn towards each moment and to say yes. This saying yes takes courage, but it's our real learning. The most important place of our learning is right in the heart of our daily lives, and not necessarily in a Dharma talk. Believe me, I realize the irony of sharing that right at this moment. But our real place of learning is in the heart of our lives, not only in a Dharma talk or on the meditation cushion. Many years ago, when I traveled all the way to Plum Village from here in Australia, I traveled together with another person who, at the end of their 3-month stay, said, you know what, there's nothing very interesting happening here in Plum Village. There's not many formal classes. There's not so much of a formal curriculum. It's not that strict, all of this litany of comments. And this person said, so it's really better that I go home to Australia and not continue to waste my time. So they traveled all the way back to Australia. I myself, as you can guess, I remained, and I still remain, because for me, my experience was completely different. There was so much to learn and to discover. In Plum Village, and in the Plum Village tradition, most of our learning is in daily life, and that's how it should be. We learn by doing, we learn by observing. We're present and awake in every moment, and we watch how our sisters and brothers walk, how they invite the bell, and so on. Of course, there are classes and so forth, but classes can only be a few hours a week at most. Our real learning often takes place outside of those times. In fact, in Buddhism, the role of a good teacher, a real teacher, is not just to teach with words, but to create a whole environment for the student to grow in. This is actually the kindness of a teacher. Many times, in fact, most of the time, the student might not even recognize what's being done, especially if we're only caught in outward appearances, in the form of things. If we're like that, then we might be like a fish that's been swimming in water for a very long time, but never realized it. A Dharma talk, a class, and so on might only last for 1 or 2 or 3 hours a week. This is an external appearance. A real teacher, a real Sangha, is always attentive and providing opportunities to grow. And we might not even notice these opportunities if we're caught in our ideas of what things need to look like. Perhaps we want to learn a particular thing and are caught in the idea that there's only one class of so long, once a week or once every 2 weeks, once a fortnight, and so on. And we begin thinking that it's not enough. But if we look deeply, we might notice that somehow the Sangha has incorporated that very thing that we want to learn into the daily schedule in a low-key way, repeating the same patterns over and over again until they sink in. So that if we're attentive, then we find that we've already received the transmission. So observe the kindness of your Sangha. Observe life as a teacher, because the majority of our lives can't be spent on the meditation cushion, can't be spent in a classroom, can't be spent in a meditation hall. And the real work, the real transformation is in each and every moment. And that's why, or one of the reasons why I consider the Plum Village practice to be quite an advanced and a subtle practice. One that, if we're fixed on outer forms and rites and rituals, will dismiss as simplistic. There are so many people who come to our Plum Village practice centers and say something like, there's nothing happening here. And I would say to them, you know what? You're exactly right. For those who come and say, oh, wow, this is so profound, I would also say you're exactly right. Because without awareness, without cultivating this discernment that we've been looking at over the past few weeks, we're simply seeing our own perceptions, which are reflected back to us. In the Buddha's time, a king came to visit where the Buddha was practicing. I hesitate to call it a monastery, but for the sake of our Dharma talk, we'll call it a monastery. In the Buddha's time, a king came to visit the monastery where the Buddha was staying for the day. And at the end of the day, the Buddha said, well, how did you enjoy your day with us? And the king said, well, it was okay, I guess, but you're doing the same things that we do at home. And the Buddha replied, well, yes, that's true. But there's one crucial difference. When we do these things, we know that we're doing them. In the ordinary is the extraordinary. In the thing we think we need to get rid of, that we don't want to look at, is in fact our pathway to liberation, our pathway of understanding. In this week's poem, which I hope will be familiar to many of you, since it can be found in the Plum Village Chanting and Recitation booklet, Chanting from the Heart, where it's called the Discourse on Absolute Truth. In the 21-day retreat of the year 2000, our teacher Tay gave a series of talks in that retreat, which was called the Eye of the Buddha, on this very discourse. This poem, this discourse, is one of the key and foundational texts of the Plum Village tradition. I wholeheartedly recommend Tay's series of talks, and they total about 4 hours on this discourse. For us, our talk this evening will probably be a lot shorter and just cover a few key points. As we head towards looking at this beautiful and profound discourse, it's extremely important for each of us to look deeply into what we consider, what each of us considers to be the ultimate in our practice lives. Even as we understand that anything that we can conceive of is by its very nature not the ultimate, since the ultimate can never be adequately described in words and concepts. However, a concept, as long as we don't mistake it for the actual experience, can be a helpful tool, a skillful means, or in Sanskrit, an upaya, that can help to motivate and orient our practice lives. I like stories, and when I was considering about the difference between the concept and the experience, I was remembering a story from my own childhood, and I think some of the Australians who grew up in the countryside will relate to this. I grew up in a rural area here in the countryside in Australia, and I remember many years ago in the early 80s, my mother read about balsamic vinegar, and she wanted to taste it very much. Nowadays, it's such an ordinary thing, balsamic vinegar. It's everywhere. But back then in rural Australia, it was not readily available. You really couldn't get it. Nobody knew about it. In fact, at the time, barbecue sauce was considered to be exotic and fancy. Anyway, my mother read a lot about balsamic vinegar and how it tasted. She really wanted to try it. And many months later, I traveled down to Sydney and was spending some time with my grandparents. My grandfather took me out to the center of Sydney, and we went to, it was called the David Jones Food Hall, a place where they had a lot of exotic items from around the world. So I was able to get a very small bottle of balsamic vinegar for my mother. And I'll never forget when she tasted it. She placed a small amount on a spoon, and she tasted the vinegar with her eyes closed. She was silent for a while, and then she said, "Nothing I read anywhere prepared me for that." Now, balsamic vinegar is probably not the ultimate for sure, but my mother's experience of tasting the vinegar for the first time and discovering that the experience, or her personal experience, was quite different to the information and, in a sense, indescribable, is one aspect of what's being looked at in the poem that we're going to be exploring this evening and for the next 2 weeks. Why don't we enjoy a sound of the bell? There's a teaching in Buddhism that is important to understand, or at least have a basic grasp of. And that's the teaching of the two truths, or the two levels of what we call reality. We could do a whole 21-day retreat on this topic. It would be an amazing retreat. So this is just a little primer. There is conventional truth, the world of the seeming pairs of opposites, day, night, suffering, liberation, and so on. And then there's ultimate truth, in which there's no separation, that everything contains everything else. The two truths, or the two levels, are not in opposition to each other. They don't cancel each other out. Rather, they contain each other. And in the ultimate sense, one is not considered to be higher or better than another. That would be a dualistic view. Rather, each conventional truth and absolute or ultimate truth are an expression of the same truth from different perspectives. And this is an important thing to understand, that both of these expressions of truth are completely true, but from different perspectives. We'll come back to this issue of perspectives a little later, but for now, let's dive into this week's poem, this week's discourse. I'll first read a translation of the poem, and then as we go through verse by verse, we'll use the translation of the poem along with the discourse on absolute truth, the Plum Village version. So this week's poem is called The Ultimate. Whoever takes on certain views, thinking of them as the best in the world, and goes around saying this is the best and everything else is inferior, will not be free from disputes. If you see some benefit for yourself through that which is seen, heard, and cognized by you, or in rites and rituals, and grasping hold of them right there and then, you'll look down on every other way. The wise point out that you're tied in a knot if you see your way as superior and the rest as inferior. A practitioner who wants to understand the way things are doesn't rely on what is seen and heard, or ideas and notions, nor ritual practices. In this world, a wise person creates no views based on intellectual knowledge, nor rites and rituals. They don't consider themselves as anybody's equal, or they're better, or inferior, no comparison at all. Abandoning own views, not grasping at more, the skillful person doesn't make themselves dependent, even in connection with knowledge. Among those who dispute, you hold no view at all. Such a person is not inclined to either side, for being or non-being, whether in this world or in the next. For a practitioner like this, there is no settling down, no entrenchment among things, views, and notions, no more grasping. There is not even the least preconceived perception. Who would be able to define such a person free of ideas and opinions? The wise have no set views, no opinions or preferences, don't adhere even to doctrines, and can't be led by outer observances. They have truly gone beyond and do not return from the free and further shore. So let's go through verse by verse, listening to each verse, and then just having a few words of commentary on some of the main themes in each verse. And again, we'll be looking at the translation and also the Plum Village version. So the first verse, whoever takes on certain views of the ultimate, thinking of them as the best in the world, and goes around saying this is the best and everything else is inferior, will not be free from disputes. And then in the Plum Village version, he who still abides by a dogmatic view, considering it as the highest in the world, thinking this is the most excellent, and disparaging other views as inferior, is still considered not to be free from disputes. The first thing that I'd like to mention in this very first verse is in the first line in the translation, we read, whoever takes on certain views. And then in the Plum Village version, he who still abides by a dogmatic view. Here, we're speaking about someone who has taken on views and ideas and notions, but hasn't had an experience of truth, of reality, hasn't actually penetrated that in an embodied way. So here, right in the very first line, and we'll see this emphasis throughout the whole poem, there's an emphasis on each of us having the experience of that which we're seeking. And I'm always reminded when I read this first line of that story that Tay tells about the calligraphy that he wrote right in the middle of the war in Vietnam. He wrote the calligraphy on the lamp next to his bed. It was in Chinese, and it said, if you want peace, if you're looking for peace, peace is with you immediately. So being able to touch the experience right in the here and now as an embodied experience, not as an idea. And if we only hold something as an idea or a notion, then it's considered to be a dogmatic view because it's not an embodied experience. When you have you've experienced something and you're embodying it, it has a flowing nature. We're not caught in it. We don't feel defensive about it. We have nothing to prove anymore. As we've shared earlier, there are two levels of truth. There's relative truth and there's absolute truth, which interpenetrate and are simultaneously existing. From the perspective of ultimate truth, if we hold a certain view and create a position, a self that considers itself right and all other things as wrong, then we're operating at the level of conventional truth. And conventional truth can never fully or adequately describe reality in and of itself. Actually, it might be interesting to consider what we mean by the word conventional. It means usual, everyday, a collective agreement. And as we've mentioned before, as we've reflected on in previous talks, we need to be able to operate on a day-by-day basis in this conventional way, but never mistake it as describing all aspects of the ultimate, but also not to think that it's something completely different. When we read or we hear the phrase abides in a dogmatic view, we have the picture of someone who dwells behind a wall of ideas. If we're not careful and discerning, then we can end up becoming quite reactive and even neurotic about the notions and the ideas that we hold. A few years ago, one of our monastic sisters had just moved to the United States from Vietnam. She hadn't met many non-Vietnamese monastics at that time. And when she met me, she came right up to me. She put her face very close to my face and looked right into my eyes and said, "Brother Phapai, your eyes are green. My eyes are brown. Do you see the same things? Do you see the same colors I do?" And I smiled and thought to myself, that's a very good question. The answer is probably not. I probably don't see things exactly the same way that you do, even if on a certain level we're sharing the same physical space and experience. What presents itself to my eye consciousness is probably slightly different from what presents itself to your eye consciousness. Is your experience of the color green the same as my experience of the color green? Who knows? When we sit and discuss our experience of the color green, of this moment, of a meal or of a friend, it becomes apparent quite quickly that while on one level we all experience the same or similar stimuli, each one of us is at the same time having a very unique response. This is one aspect of what's meant by two terms that are commonly used in Buddhist psychology, the universal and the particular. The term universal refers to a broad, generalized experience shared in some way by many, if not most of us. For example, the color green or the taste of a banana. And the particular refers to your individual response to and experience of something. For example, the color green or the taste of a banana. In Buddhist psychology, there's also another framework of reference that seems to me to be important to understand as we delve into views, and especially delve into views with a reference to sense impressions. That's something called the three modes of cognition. Yes, it's quite a technical term, but please don't be afraid. The three modes of cognition describe the way that our consciousness interacts with what we call the world. Having a basic understanding of these three modes of cognition and becoming aware of which mode of cognition that we're operating under in our daily life can be incredibly helpful. The first mode of cognition is called things in and of themselves. This type of cognition or direct perception is actually extremely rare for us. There's a beautiful rose bush growing on the veranda outside my room here in Mountain Spring. It's quite lovely. And I find my attention being drawn to it quite regularly. My limited perception of the rose is filtered through many lenses or many interpretations, if you like. For example, I might consider the rose to be a flower, which is already categorizing it and putting it into some kind of box. I might consider it as a plant, or pale pink, or lovely, and so on, or fragrant. All of these labels are correct as far as they go, but they remain firmly within the realm of words and concepts. And words and concepts can never give us a complete picture of something. they can't adequately describe the full and ultimate nature of something. I'm reminded of the time that the Buddha was asked to describe nirvana. Rather than saying what nirvana is, which would have saved a lot of commentators a lot of time and a lot of ink over the years, but it would have given us even more concepts to grasp onto. The Buddha described nirvana in terms of what it isn't, what it is not. It is not hot. It is not cold. It is not born, undying, and so on. Nirvana is the ultimate extinction of all concepts and notions. We might want to stop here for just a minute and contemplate this sentence again. Nirvana is the extinction of all concepts and notions. Many of us have heard that phrase, which is used often in translation in Buddhism, entering nirvana. Now, if we hold that concept of entering nirvana, then we're holding to the view that nirvana is a location that exists within a realm of time and space. And time and space is relative. It's not the ultimate. Or do we think that nirvana exists separately from time and space? That would also be a conventional designation, because it would be considering pairs of opposites. Or does nirvana transcend these pairs of opposites? Time and space, self and others, living beings and lifespan are all notions and concepts. While these concepts and notions are helpful and necessary for us to get through the day, they don't give us a complete picture of ultimate reality. If you're hiking or you're bushwalking in the woods, in the bush, then knowing which way is north is probably helpful. But we can't use concepts to describe nirvana, which is beyond all notions and concepts. It's quite rare for us simply to be with what I call our bare experience. We're usually unconsciously or consciously interpreting, labeling, or telling ourselves stories about our experience. And it's often those stories or those interpretations that we call reality. It's actually quite rare to be able to perceive something like a flower, an emotion, or a sense impression, just as it is, without layers of interpretation. If we do so, it's usually quite brief and doesn't last long. As we continue to develop the quality of attention that we call mindfulness, our capacity for sustained attention deepens and insight has the right conditions to manifest. So let's have a sound of the bell. The second of the three modes of cognition is the mode that is most commonly active in our day-to-day life. It's called the realm of representations. This is what I was referring to a moment ago when I mentioned that when we experience a sense impression, such as a sight, a sound, or a taste, we tell ourselves a story about it, or a feeling arises based on a past experience, a concept, a notion, or a tendency. To put it very simply, the realm of representations refers to the mode of cognition that arises when our sense bases, our eyes, our ears, our nose, our tongue, and so on, come into contact with a stimulus, a sound, a taste, a sensation, and so on. and we interpret that experience subtly or less subtly. We're not in contact with the actual object of our attention just as it is, but rather we're in contact with what that object represents for us. Each of us, when we taste or hear or smell or see something, makes an interpretation on a very subtle level. And very often it's that interpretation rather than the object itself that nurtures happiness or sadness, despair or depression. And it can be very helpful for us to begin to distinguish between the bare experience and our interpretation. And over time, by practicing in this way, what we call reality or the truth becomes just a little bit more porous, just a little bit more expansive. The third mode of cognition is called the realm of mere images. And these are mental images occurring for most of us in our dream states or when our eyes are closed. Any meditator has gone through the experience where we're picturing all kinds of things. Getting close to lunch, we're imagining what we're going to be eating, we're seeing the dishes, all these kind of things. This might be a dream, a daydream, or simply the image of something. We often find that for those of us who are experiencing strong emotional challenges, the realm of mere images tends to be quite predominant. So these three modes of cognition are all ways through which we perceive and interact with what we call the world. So we'll continue on with the second verse. If you see some benefit for yourself through that which is seen, heard, and cognized by you, or in rites and rituals, and grasping hold of them right there and then, you look down upon every other way. Or in the Discourse on Absolute Truth, when seeing, hearing, or sensing something, and considering it as the only thing that can bring comfort and advantage to self, one is always inclined to get caught in it and rule out everything else as inferior. Many times over the past months, I've been sharing that while there is deep comfort in the practice, real practice is not about getting comfortable in the sense of settling or becoming entrenched in ideas, behaviors, or forms. One of the most subtle forms of entrenchment is the way that if we don't apply the lens of discernment and deep looking, then we can actually build up a whole self-identity around our practice, while at the same time bolstering our self-concept. This is my practice. This is not my practice. This is the right way. Every other way is the wrong way. In the beginning of our meditation practice, many of us begin by practicing in order to get some kind of benefit, or we think we're going to get some kind of benefit. Peace, happiness, clarity, and so on. Hopefully over time, as we continue along the path, we begin to see that in a way, this is an incomplete view. And it can actually be a very subtle way of building up our ego. We discovered a couple of weeks ago that in one of the earlier poems, that if we don't have this nature of discernment, of looking deeply, that in fact, some of the forms of our practice can actually be subtly supporting our entrenchments. That rather than getting something, our practice is actually about letting go on deeper and deeper levels, about looking at our tendency to not want to be challenged in any way. Because if we're entrenched, if we do get challenged, goodness, we become so defensive. There's that incredibly deep Zen koan. This morning, I was offering a Dharma talk here, and I was speaking about the Zen koan, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. It's quite a shocking koan. And that's because if you meet a teacher, whether in the form of a person or in the form of a situation who only confirms every notion and idea and concept that you have already and doesn't challenge you in any way to grow, then that is not a real teacher for you. A real teacher, whether in the form of a person or a situation, will call you forth, will challenge you, and a real student will allow themselves to be called forth over and over again, to step out of their comfort zone over and over again. Let's continue on with the next verse. The wise point out that you're tied in a knot if you see your way as superior and the rest as inferior. A practitioner who wants to understand the way things are doesn't rely on what is seen and heard, or ideas and notions or ritual practices. And in the Discourse on Absolute Truth, caught in one's view and considering all other views as inferior, this attitude is considered by the wise as bondage, as the absence of freedom. A good practitioner is never too quick to believe what is seen, heard, and sensed, including rules and rights. We spoke last time about the knots that bind us, that hold us in the round of samsara, this continual sense, this experience of repeated dissatisfaction. Here we have the same image again, the image of if we hold a view of our way as superior, then we're caught in a knot. We're tied to this cycle. Why is that? Because we've created a self. We've created something out of it. We've made it something. In Zen, in the meditator's life, the greatest wisdom, the greatest security of all is somewhat paradoxically the capacity to be not sure. To know that what we experience is only a very small part of reality and not reality itself. To know that reality is constantly revealing itself to us like a flower opening its petals. And the view that we have of reality will depend on our perspective. This morning, I shared a story of many years ago when I was leading a retreat at the Mariposa Institute in California. And the meditation hall was on one side of a deep canyon, and the huts that we were staying in were on the other side of the canyon, connected by a pathway with a lot of hairpin turns. I made it a practice to stop every time I came to one of the hairpin turns and to look at the view. Every time I returned to an upper or a lower hairpin turn, I was seeing the same things, but from a different perspective each time. I would see something new each time. The way we see things depends on our perspective. If we're standing outside of those things rather than experiencing them from within. And if we're standing outside of something, then we have a view of it. And by its nature, if we have a view of it, most likely our view will only be of a certain aspect of something, a certain perspective, a certain position. As practitioners, and definitely in terms of ultimate truth, whenever there's a word or a concept or a view, then we're taking up a position. In terms of ultimate reality, when we take up a fixed position, as I just mentioned, where by its very nature, by the very nature of a fixed position, we're only seeing something partially. This is really what's meant by the old Zen saying, open mouth, already a mistake. Our great mistake is that we mistake our interpreted experiences for reality itself. Certainly, we will hopefully have some overlap with others, but we usually think that the way that we think, the way that we experience things is reality, and it's really just an interpretation. In fact, in a very simple but profound text in the Udana, there's the story of Bahia, a wanderer who came to the Buddha and asked the Buddha, what's the essence of the practice? How do I transform suffering? And the Buddha said, when you see something, just see it. When you hear something, just hear it. When you taste something, just taste it. And don't have any therefore. It's when you have a therefore that you have suffering. When you don't have the therefore, the whole mass of suffering ends. So in this verse that we're currently reflecting on, we're asked to constantly examine our positions and our perspectives in each moment and to understand them for what they are. Simply perspectives and positions, ideas about things, which might be useful in a certain sense, but they're not the thing in and of themselves. Most of us get this when we're talking about what we consider to be everyday things. But when we're talking about spiritual experience, it's a little harder to grasp because we want to pin these spiritual experiences down into concepts and notions. There's the famous story of the blind people touching an elephant and describing what an elephant is. Some touch the legs and say, oh, an elephant is like a big tree trunk. And others touch the trunk of the elephant and say the elephant is like a big winding snake, and so on and so on. Each touches one part of the elephant and describes their experience. And that's absolutely true for that person. But it's not the complete experience in and of itself. So continuing to the next verse. In this world, a wise person creates no views based on intellectual knowledge, nor rites and rituals. They don't consider themselves as anybody's equal, or they're better or inferior. No comparison at all. The Discourse on Absolute Truth reads, a good practitioner has no need to set up a new theory for the world, using the knowledge that he's picked up, or the rites and rules that he's practicing. He does not consider himself as superior, inferior, or equal to anyone. Here in this verse, we're speaking of personal embodied experience, tasting the balsamic vinegar for yourself, rather than intellectual knowledge. In Plum Village and in the Plum Village tradition, we really don't care how eloquently somebody can speak, or how many books they've read, or how many academic dissertations they have. We want to see how that person walks slowly and mindfully in every moment, how they open and close a door with care, with love and attention, how they pick up a cup and how they put it down. This is the real Dharma talk. That's where the rubber meets the road. That's embodiment. In this verse, we also encounter the three self-complexes which arise in each and every moment. Greater, less than, or equal. When we compare ourselves to others, we fix ourselves and others in a certain position based on separation, a kind of selfing. This morning in this Dharma talk, which I shared with an amazing teacher, Dharma teacher Larry Ward, one of the senior Dharma teachers in the Plum Village tradition, Larry Ward shared something very beautiful. He said that for him, his experience of self is that self is a process, a continual process. And so with these three self-complexes, we're fixing that self, which is a continual emergent process within ourselves and also in that which we call the other, into a fixed position when everything is always in a state of change. In fact, if we look deeply, we see that we're all three of these complexes at once and none of them. I'd like to recommend for each of us a little exercise on labeling, which can be quite a deep meditation. I learned it from a hitchhiker at a gas station, a petrol station in the US. Where I've always got my antenna out for the Dharma. I'll never forget having tea with my teacher, and he said to me, you know what, Brother Fapai, in Mahayana Buddhism, one of the deepest teachings is that if we are truly aware, there's nothing that's not the Dharma. So this Dharma I picked up from an encounter I had with a hitchhiker at a petrol station in the US. When I stepped out of the car, we were traveling to give a day of mindfulness, and I stepped out of the car while the brothers were filling up the gas tank. The hitchhiker said, "Whoa, what are you?" And I thought this was a very deep question, particularly if I use that invitation to identify and examine all the labels I call myself or that I'm called. You might like to take a notebook and contemplate all the labels you call yourself, all the labels that other people call you. Australian, American, French, African, Vietnamese, European, Chinese, Korean, man, woman, non-binary, straight, gay, fluid, young, old, sick, well, doctor, lawyer, monk, householder. The list goes on endlessly. So whatever labels come up for you, whatever they might be, and there might be a lot, write them down. And as you go through all of these labels, these conventional designations, and examine them, consider what is meant by them, how they feel in your body, and whether they adequately describe you. And keep going until you exhaust all the labels, till you've gone through all the layers of labels that you call yourself, that you identify as, and that other people identify you as. But then see if you can discover what's underneath that and how to express that. Continuing on with the next verse of the poem. Abandoning own views and not grasping at more, the skillful person doesn't make themselves dependent, even in connection with knowledge. Among those who dispute, you hold no view at all. The Discourse on Absolute Truth. A good practitioner abandons the notion of self and the tendency to cling to views. He or she is free and does not depend on anything, even on knowledge. He does not take sides in controversies and does not hold to any view or dogma. The first thing I'd like to share with this verse is around that word dependent. The skillful person, the person who has skill, skill in terms of the Dharma, skill in terms of the path. Among the Buddha's last words were, work out your own liberation with diligence. And so here, when we're talking about the skillful person who is not dependent anymore, this is someone who has had a taste of happiness, had a taste of liberation, has had a taste of the peace that we're talking about, and doesn't need anybody else to tell them about that experience. They know it for themselves. Abandoning, which we spoke of in an earlier series of Dharma talks. Here, the word abandoning means leaving behind with no more nostalgia, the places of our false security, to find our real security. And this is totally scary, not relying on anything. There might even be times when that's not actually even possible for many of us in our everyday lived experience. This line is also a reminder of the line in the previous poem where we were compared to being like monkeys swinging from tree to tree, grasping on branch and then the next branch and the next branch. I like to think of a walking stick or crutches or maybe a baby walker. In the beginning, a baby needs the baby walker to learn how to walk, to build up its muscles, but it's usually necessary for only a period of time. And it's the same in terms of the practice. In some way, all of the words, the concepts, the lists of things, as delightful as they are just skillful means to point us in the direction of discovery for ourselves. Otherwise, they're meaningless. By the way, when thinking about truth here, please don't get caught up in pairs of opposites here and create the idea of a falsehood, which is in opposition to the thing we call the truth. In the realm of absolute truth, there's no place for pairs of opposites. Since if we're caught in pairs of opposites, there's a this and a that. Let's have a sound of the bell. Let's continue with the next verse. Such a person is not inclined to either side for being or non-being, whether in this world or the next. For a practitioner like this, there is no settling down, no entrenchment among things, views, and notions, no more grasping. And in the Discourse on Absolute Truth, he does not seek for anything or cling to anything, either this extreme or the other extreme, either in this world or the next world. He has abandoned all views and no longer has the need to seek for comfort or refuge in any theory or ideology. In an earlier series, we spoke about the extremes of being and non-being, particularly in terms of tanha or craving or thirst. We also spoke about the world and birth being not only a one-time event, but being a process that's occurring moment by moment, this process of becoming. And so here in this verse, these aspects are what is being spoken about. So it's quite a deep and profound verse. So you might like to go back and listen to some of those earlier talks on being and non-being and this moment by moment process of birth, of becoming. So not clinging to extremes here is a reminder of another aspect of something that we've considered in some depth in the earlier series on the Noble Eightfold Path, and that's the middle way between extremes. In a discourse in the Chinese canon, which can be found in Chanting from the Heart, it's called the Discourse on the Middle Way. We encounter a new way of looking and practicing with the middle way. Usually we consider the middle way as the middle way between extremes. And here in this discourse, there's a new opportunity for cultivating this middle way between extremes. The discourse goes, the middle way says that this is because that is. That is not because that is not. Because there is ignorance, there are impulses. Because there are impulses, there is consciousness. Because there is consciousness, there is the psyche-soma, the nama-rupa. Because there is the psyche-soma, there are the six senses. Because there are the six senses, there is contact. Because there's contact, there's feeling, painful, pleasant, or neutral. Because there's feeling, there's thirst and craving. Because there's thirst and craving, there's grasping. Because there's grasping, there is becoming. Because there's becoming, there is birth. Because there's birth, there's old age, death, grief, and sorrow. This is how the entire mass of suffering arises. But with the fading away of ignorance, impulses cease. With the fading away of impulses, consciousness ceases. And finally, birth, old age, death, grief, and sorrow fade away. This is how the entire mass of suffering ceases. So in this discourse, we're invited to encounter the middle way in terms of looking at dependent origination or interdependent co-arising in each and every moment. In the beginning of this current series of talks, I mentioned that as we move through this text in the Book of Eights, we would be touching some of the deep roots of the order of interbeing. And in this text, we touched two of the key spirits of the order of interbeing, which you can find in the charter and in the precepts of the order of interbeing. One is non-dogmatism, or non-attachment to views. And the other is direct experimentation with the nature of reality through reflecting on interdependent co-arising. Basically, reflecting on the causes and conditions that give rise to this process of samsara, which is not only an external process, but a process that's taking place within our own consciousness in each and every moment. For a practitioner like this, there is no settling down in their entrenchments. At the time of the Buddha, at the time that, in particular, these discourses were being offered, the Buddhist community was still very much a mendicant community, moving around constantly. The maximum amount of time to remain in one place, with the exception of the annual 3-month retreat, was 3 nights at the foot of a tree. Now, actually, one can get quite entrenched in 3 nights. But in this practice, we're always moving further. We're not mistaking the knowledge that we have for absolute truth, but being willing to let go over and over again in order for new insight to blossom. Just like the trees here in Mountain Spring, which are now covered with beautiful new spring growth. And that only comes about when they're willing to let go of the old growth of last season. And continuing on, there is not even the least preconceived perception. Who would be able to define such a person free of ideas and opinions? And the Discourse on Absolute Truth, to the wise person, there are no longer any views concerning what is seen, heard, or sensed. How could one judge or have an opinion concerning such a pure being who has let go of all views? We can sum up this stanza by the old Zen saying, don't make anything. As we heard in the story of Bahia earlier, just be with bare experience. And don't get caught up with all of the imagined stories about the experiences that you're having. Does anyone remember that song, Don't Believe the Hype? I think it was Public Enemy back a long time ago. I've personally appropriated that title. And I use it as a daily practice reminder. Don't believe your hype. Because most of the time we do. And if we're able to not believe our hype, which, let's face it, most of the time what we call reality is us just buying into our hype about something, then this is a real practice of letting go, of holding with an open hand. And then the final verse of this poem is, the wise have no set views, no opinions or preferences, don't adhere even to doctrines and can't be led by outer observances. They've truly gone beyond and do not return from the free and further shore. In the Discourse on Absolute Truth, a wise person no longer feels the need to set up dogmas or choose an ideology. All dogmas and ideologies have been abandoned by such a person. A noble one, a real noble one, is never caught in rules or rites. He or she is advancing steadfastly to the shore of liberation and will never return to the realm of bondage. So in Buddhism, we have this metaphor of building ourselves a raft of teachings that help us to transform our individual and collective situation, and putting that raft onto the river and then crossing over to the other shore, never mistaking the raft itself for the shore. And this is not a one-time journey, but a moment by moment experience, a continual crossing over on all levels to the shore of freedom, the shore of happiness, which, as I've shared in earlier talks, if we have that experience of crossing over to the other shore, then we have this experience of, in this metaphor, it's described as having this experience of making this journey of 1,000 lifetimes, the journey of a second, and reaching what we call the other shore, of thinking that we're standing on a shore of suffering and then reaching a shore of liberation. Then we drag ourselves up on the shore and we stand up and we look around and we realize that we're exactly where we were before, but somehow everything, including ourselves, has changed because our perspective has changed. So dear friends, this discourse is an incredibly profound discourse, and I hope that you'll find time over the next couple of weeks to sit with it each day, to reflect on the lines of this text, and hopefully you'll have a chance to listen to our teacher Tay's talks on this discourse on absolute truth that were given in 2000. I hope that you've received some benefit from tonight's talk on this discourse. We'll end with 3 sounds of the bell.